Hello there. In this video, I'll thoroughly review May 23 Economics Paper 1 for HSL students. I hope this exam review will be a bit of help for those who need some productive economics revision. Then let's give it a go. We've got the exam paper, Economics Higher Level Paper 1. This one was for the Time Zone 2 students. Let's check the 3 pairs of questions. Number 1 question is quite interesting. Unlike the normal setting of giving the number 1 question only from the unit 2 micro, this one has 2 different units that compose this question 1. First, A is from unit 2 micro. Question B is a bit of combination of unit 2 and 1, but largely this question is from unit 1. Question 2 is from macro. Question 3 is from global. And let's get going for analyzing and outlining the paper 1 essay questions. Question 1A. Explain why products may have different income elasticities of demand, so-called YD. First off, we're supposed to define keywords from the prompt, such as YD, and some terms that are related to YD analysis, such as inferior goods, normal goods, things like that. I'm going to draw one single diagram throughout this essay, which is angle curve. First one would be about the products that have positive YD coefficient. Body 2 will be about the analysis on the products that have negative YD coefficient. Anywho, coming back to the body 1, I'm going to explain the case when one's income increases. There are certain types of products that increase its quantity demand as well. To answer the logic, I need to identify those goods as normal goods. Specific examples of such normal goods would be leisure, luxury cars, healthcare. It's quite subjective. However, many people can agree to the items that can be categorized as normal goods. Amongst such goods, some may have high income elasticity of demand, especially when they are not necessities or have loads of substitutes. And it's going to be vice versa to those who have low income elasticity when they are necessary goods or they have few substitutes. As I've mentioned earlier, body 2 content would be about the products that have negative YD coefficient. I'm going to explain the logic how, when one's income increases, there are certain types of goods that decreases its quantity demand. On the other hand, when income decreases, such goods demand would increase. What kinds of goods are having such consumption pattern? Those can be identified as inferior goods. Specifically, common examples of inferior goods would be used items or public transportations and junk food, etc. And lastly, I'm going to finish the analysis with saying that just like the positive coefficient YD items, negative coefficient items can have high income elasticity of demand, especially when they're not necessities or have loads of substitutes. And that's going to be vice versa again to the necessities and rare goods. That's the end of question 1A. Moving on to question B. Using real-world examples, discuss the assumption that consumers always seek to maximize their utility. This is a very interesting and unexpected question. I'm pretty sure many students who took the exam in May this year would have been quite surprised in a way by given this question, I guess. Anywho, define the terms utility and rational consumer choice to fill out the intro contents. Moving on to body 1, I'm going to somehow, in a way, I'm going to agree to the assumption that how consumers do seek to maximize their utility, or how do they seek to maximize their utility. That's going to be the body 1 content. To illustrate that, I'm going to explain the theory of consumer rationality, which presents the idea that consumers do make economic decisions according to the condition that they would love to maximize their utility all the time by comparing every information that they've got. According to the theory of consumer rationalities, consumers are making their economic decisions according to the perfect information given. And also at the same time, they do calculate the best combination of resources allocated. And they always consider their opportunity cost and things like that. So they make the best decision to maximize their utility. That's the assumption. And maybe I can draw showing individual decision-making scenarios, such as like y-axis product A, x-axis product B, so the consumer compares the opportunity of each and make the best combination of its own resources. 42 would be about disagreement to the assumption, such as how consumers may fail to seeking for maximizing their utility. In other words, what makes that not quite rational? To start with, I'm going to explain the idea that there are some limitations to the assumption of consumer rationality. According to the real-life examples that economists have observed, also specifically from the behavioral economics view, consumers tend to be limited to make rational decisions because we can't get perfect information when it comes to making purchases or making decisions. That's impossible. And also, to be more theoretical, there are some defined reasons why we can't make best decision or why we can't make perfectly rational decision. It's because of bounded rationalities that we have as a limitation, or because of anchoring effect or framing effect, things like that we have learned from Unit 1 when we learned about the behavior economics. So all these are making us not to make best decision. We end up failing to maximize our utility. There are two real-life examples that I would love to bring. First one is the evidence of mental accounting that make us to fail to maximize our utility, such as luxury brands, such as Chanel. We put very rationally subjective value on luxury items, even though there is little quality difference from the other middle price brands or relatively cheaper brands or something like that. So we sort of pay insanely high prices to buy the brand image, I want to say. Second real life example would be framing effect. If from the real life setting, there is a beverage brand, Minute Maid, and it's not only for the Minute Maid, but I want to be specific. So anywho, the brand, when they sell their beverage in the plastic package, they put some wordings that emphasizing or only emphasizing 100% fruit juice, or they are full of fresh ingredients or things like that. However, it doesn't necessarily bold it, or it doesn't necessarily emphasize the chemicals or sugary products that are already added along with the natural ingredients, but it is only framing the natural ingredients that have been a part of the other ingredients. So consumers can get some framed idea that this brand is selling really healthy and organic products, which is not necessarily the case. It's quite rare to get a paper 1 question from Unit 1, honestly, but we get one. So it's again emphasizing the fact that we need to revise more thoroughly, I believe. Moving on, question 2A. Explain 2 economic costs of high unemployment. Yes, very typical macro question. I'm going to start my essay with defining unemployment. Especially, I'm going to connect that to one of the macroeconomic objectives of government, which is lowering unemployment. And since the question specifically asks us to explain 2 types of costs, so my body 1 content should be about the first type of cost that unemployment can create. Especially, I'm going to focus on short-term cost. When it comes to focusing on short-term cost of unemployment, it has to be discussed from cyclical unemployment, and then I'm going to explain the short-term cost of having high employment in a country's economy, such as economic and social and personal cost. So to be more specific, I can say when a country's economy experiences recession, in other words, deflationary gap, how firms lay off workers, which causes lower production, and being seen from the aggregate demand, it would lower investment. We just identify I and C have decreased within the AD. For government, it has to increase transfers payments, such as unemployment benefit, things like that. However, tax collection will be decreased. Why? Because consumers and firms would pay less taxes, then discourage the economic activities. However, which means it's going to increase the government budget deficit. Ultimately, all those 3 above would make the real output of the country being decreased. I can illustrate the analysis with an ADAS diagram showing AD shift to the left. Body 2, second type of cost that unemployment can create will be discussed from focusing on the long-term impact. This time, the type of unemployment that I'm going to shed light on will be the structural unemployment. And then I'm going to explain the long-term cost of having high structural unemployment in a country's economy, such as when a country's labor market faces fundamental demand changes due to the industrial relocation or technological development, then what's going to happen to the labor market? Firms are going to lay off redundant workers, and such laid off workers with less labor competitiveness would lose their productivity. We can illustrate the situation with the example of the US automaking industry. They have relocated their production facilities to cheaper countries. Therefore, certain states in America have been economically stagnated, such as Detroit. I want to say this one is more about the long-term labor productivity and fundamental economic productivity, like the one above. Even with this case, government has to increase transfer payment. However, tax collection from such a state would decrease, so government budget deficit would be worsened, especially the state government. It's going to be more fundamentally damaging the national productivity, national competitiveness, so that I can illustrate the situation with LRAS curve shift to the left, or maybe PPC curve shift to the left. Next, question B. Using real-world examples, discuss the view that low unemployment can only be achieved at the expense of higher inflation. It's important to pay attention to not to go off the track, or it's best to find some decent balance of discussing two very different macroeconomic objectives. So in introduction, I can define the terms unemployment and inflation by connecting them to macroeconomic objectives. Body 1 would literally agree to the view saying that how low unemployment is actually being achieved through the expense of inflation. It means that there is an inevitable inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. What do you mean by that? Your country is having low unemployment. It means your country experiences high consumption and high investment and high production, and then literally increasing its economic activities. Therefore, many people are being hired and being utilized as efficient human resources. And it means that it's going to pull the aggregate demand of the economy. So it's going to necessarily result in high inflation. In other words, higher GDP. To present the idea, I'm going to draw Phillips curve, short-run Phillips curve, showing the inverse relationship between the inflation and unemployment. Also, maybe I can also draw ADAS diagram to present the demand pull inflation, demand shift to the right, higher inflation, higher GDP, low unemployment. And since it is the 50 marker, I need to use a real life example. This time, maybe I can use the example of like China or South Korea, where have been prospering economically for the past decade. We can observe the fact that those economically growing countries all have commonly experienced higher inflation when they boost their economic activities and growing their GDP with relatively low unemployment. Body 2 would be about the disagreement to the view, in a way, how low unemployment is not necessarily achieved through the expense of inflation. It's not necessarily always the case that there will be inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. First, I'm going to explain how and why in some occasions those two above can go to the same direction, not the opposite, or even there is no expense of one another. To answer the logic that's saying that those two can go to the same direction, not their opposite, I can say that when a country experiences cost-push inflation, not the demand pull, it means the country experiences stagflation. And in this case, both are increasing. Both unemployment and inflation increase at the same time, which means they go to the same direction, not the inverse. And to answer the second logic, which says there can be no expense of one another, I can say, according to the monetarist and new classical economics view, it says in the long term, when the economy goes through the maturity and the stabilization through the self-adjustment, the price level, in other words, the inflation becomes perfectly flexible and adjustable, self-correcting. Therefore, there is no trade-off between the unemployment and the inflation. How do I prove How do I prove such logic? I can draw a LRPC diagram, which is vertical, showing no trade-off between two. Or maybe I can also present the stagflation with showing SRAS shift to the left. This time I can use the real-life example of the UK economy, which experiences stagflation for years, I would say so far, which is originated from cost-push inflation. And it is mainly because of the higher energy cost, and it is causing high inflation in the economy at the same time, discouraging the economic activities and business confidence. Therefore, it is causing high unemployment as well. So it doesn't have inverse relationship. They are going to the same direction of both increase. All right, that's about the macro. Last pair is from the global economy. Question A. Explain how dependence on primary sector production may be a barrier to economic growth. As always, I'm going to start my intro with defining key terms such as primary sector production and economic growth. In body one, I'm going to present first way how over-dependence on primary sector production becomes a barrier in the short term. So this body is going to be about short-term concentrated. First, I would like to explain the inelastic nature of primary product that make the industry inherently volatile. And I want to add the explanation of inelastic demand is also the case for this type of products, such as consumers also don't necessarily dramatically increase the consumption or decrease the consumption or things like that. So it may limit the industry and the workers to further grow and innovate. I can make the discussion deeper by saying that how the relatively low and unstable value of such agriculture product or in general primary product would let the firms and then workers being trapped in the low revenue earning and unstable and low incomes that can ultimately hinder the investment and innovation of the country. Also, I can say how due to the external factors such as climate change or trade deals, those kind of things can make the country's exports of such primary product be very, very unstable and relatively inelastic, a huge trade deficit. All these above reasons, we can say over-dependence on primary sector production can be a barrier to the economy in the short term. Why? Because it is causing the GDP being kept low. And I can present the idea with drawing the diagram of AD shifting to the left. AD2 would have the same logic. I love to focus more on the long-term consequences of having such high overdependence on primary sector production. I want to talk about things from a more long-term perspective. So first, I want to say how over-specialization on primary sector products can limit the development of other industries, such as like manufacturing or tertiary sectors that are mainly operating in most of the rich countries. Also, I'm going to explain how such lack of diversification let the country lose export competitiveness within the global trade market. Having lack of diversification in their industrial sector means that the country would be overly relying on and being volatile to import it. I'm going to finish the body by saying that everything that I've just said above would make the country being left behind to achieve decent and healthy economic growth. And then the diagram that I can present the idea would be maybe PPC diagram shifting to the left, or maybe LRAS shift to the left as well. Last question B, using real world examples, evaluate the view that market-based policies may be ineffective in promoting the economic development of the world's poorest countries. Intro defining supply side policy, and one of the types would be market-based policy, and one more definition I can add would be the goal of economic development. 41, as you can expect, I'm going to present some ideas that agree to the view, which means I'm going to focus on analyzing the idea that how market-based policy would be ineffective to make poorest countries being economically developed. In what ways market-based policy would be ineffective? First, I can say how market-based policies such as trade liberalization, privatization, and deregulation, things like that, those can be rather ineffective to poorest countries. And the reason why would be the case is because considering the fact that those countries in general lack the institutional framework to operate the economy, such as legal system, political system and banking system, whatever in general that can make the country fair and smoothly operating. The lack of such would make the free market-based policies would not work in the first place. Since such countries lack such necessary systems, even if you do conduct market-based policy, it wouldn't work because those policies are based on the assumption that free market economy works properly and smoothly. And however, the country doesn't have such system to run the policies, so may fail to effectively work. They work. To be more specific, to explain why wouldn't they work? First, domestic firms simply are not ready to compete with the foreign competitors. And foreign firms, they will be more discouraged and less incentivized to invest in the country since they have no guarantee of safely and stably operating business in the country. So no FDI or no long-term investment according to the market-based policies. Or maybe foreign firms can be highly likely to be exploitative to the domestic countries or domestic consumers or domestic workers, creating lots of negative externalities, such as exploitation of the environment or workers or things like that. Simply, they just take advantage of the poor situation. It's going to worsen the situation, such as worsen the income inequalities, poverty, or even environment, or whatever you can expect. I can present a real-life example of many ELDC countries' case, such as African countries. They have only ended up being exploited by rich countries' firms, such as oil companies or mineral companies or things like that. Those countries' economic activities done in African countries have not necessarily made the African countries being richer, fundamentally, to be fair. So it sort of supports the idea that market-based policies wouldn't be quite effective to the poorest country. For this, so we can talk about the disagreement to the view in a way. Market-based policy can make the poorest countries being economically developed. I'm going to explain potential benefits of market-based policies, such as creating greater competition and diversifying consumer choices, ultimately making the business sector being more efficient and more productive. What I mean by this is that, considering the fact that most of poorest countries have too high dependence on primary sectors, such as minerals or agricultural products, considering the fact that the domestic industries are too underdeveloped or too highly relying on a certain sector, accepting more foreign firms to invest and start more diverse businesses in their country can increase the productive potential that haven't been done by the country's government themselves. Also, I can explain the situation where most of poor countries lack the capacity to gear towards further market economic system themselves. You cannot make the country to be more capital-based or investment-based or things like that. So you need some help from the foreign firms to attract more investment and to gear the market-oriented, to gear towards the market-oriented economy. Lastly, I want to talk about the fact that most of poorest countries are under the situation of politically and socially under-liberalized. So conducting market-based policies in that sense can boost market economy and then capitalism, which can somehow boost freer and fairer economic and social mood. I want to use the example of China. It simply conducted loads of market-based policies. It has located its economic status as the second richest country, and then it has transformed the economy from the poor communist country to the second richest country in the world. Yes, so far I have analyzed and outlined the People 1 essay questions for May 23 exams. If you have come this much far with me, thank you so much. I hope this exam review video will be a bit of help for making your economics revision more productive. Thank you so much. Bye.